Happy Wednesday! Time for the read aloud. I, of course, filmed this a week ahead of time, so this is actually the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I haven't seen you guys in a while. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. I'm getting ready for tomorrow. Of course, we're doing it a lot smaller this year, like I'm sure most of you are. So, we haven't read The Hobbit in a few weeks because of weird holidays and things like that. And so, we got to the point where Bilbo had left Rivendell. They were in a big storm, and there were stone giants, stone rocks, and they were trying to get across the mountain. But they had a lot of trouble, and they finally found a nice dry cave. A nice little cave. I wonder how that's going to turn out. Been a lot of foreshadowing about this, and it doesn't look good. But right now, they're falling asleep in a nice little cave in the mountains. And we'll see how it goes. It's going to be great. There was also a video, and this one may seem a little kiddish. The two of them are kind of younger, but then they are going to you're going to like them. They get better it's about anti-bullying videos. And the students really like the ones coming up. They're really neat. But the first ones are a little more obvious. They're for younger children. But I think it's a good intro. It's a good way to start to talk about bullying and anti-bullying. We haven't really had much of a chance to do this because, one, you guys are just awesome. And two, there's only like 8, 10 kids in the room at a time. And it really hasn't turned out any bullying yet. So that's awesome. And you guys are great anyway. You would be nice to each other. So I'm sure when we get back to having full classrooms, the sooner the better. I know we all can't wait. We'll be ready for it. So we're going to do that once a week along with the read aloud, okay? All right. We'll see ya, and it's time for Hobbit. Connor, wish you a happy Thanksgiving.
Well,
all right.
Late Thanksgiving.
Well,
early.
Well,
It's Happy Thanksgiving.
There you go. All right.
It's probably late, but according to the time.
It turned out a good thing that night that they had brought little Bilbo with them, after all. For somehow, he could not get to sleep for a long while, and when he did sleep, he had very nasty dreams. He dreamed that a crack in the wall at the back of the cave got bigger and bigger and opened wider and wider, and he was very afraid, but he could not call out or do anything but lie and look. Then he dreamed that the floor of the cave was giving way, and he was slipping, beginning to fall down, goodness knows where to. At that he woke up with a horrible start and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave. It was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the pony's tails disappearing into it. Of course, he gave a very loud yell, as loud as a yell a hobbit can give, which is surprising for their size. Out jumped the goblins. Big goblins, great ugly-looking goblins, lots of goblins, before you could say rocks and blocks. There were 6 to each dwarf at least, and 2 even for Bilbo, and they were all grabbed and carried through the crack, before you could say tinder and flint, but not Gandalf. Bilbo's yell had done that much good. It had wakened him up wide in a splintered second, and when goblins came to grab him, there was a terrific flash like lightning in the cave, a smell like gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. The crack closed with a snap, and Bilbo and the dwarves were on the wrong side of it. Where was Gandalf? Of that, neither they nor the goblins had any idea. The goblins did not wait to find out. They seized Bilbo and the dwarves and hurried them along. It was a deep, deep dark, such as only goblins that have taken to living in the heart of the mountains can see through. The passages there were crossed and tangled in all directions, but the goblins knew the way. as well as you do to the nearest post office. And the way went down, and it was most horribly stuffy. The goblins were very rough, and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in their horrible stony voices. And Bilbo was more unhappy even than when the troll had picked him up by his toes. He wished again and again for his nice, bright hobbit hole. Not for the last time. Now there came a glimmer of red light before them. The goblins began to sing or croak, keeping time with their flat feet on the stone, shaking their prisoners as well. Clap, snap, the black, crack, grab, grab, pinch, nab, and down, down to Goblin Town you go, my lad. Clash, crash, crush, smash, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs, pound, pound for underground, oh, my lad. Swish, smack, whip, crack, batter and beat, yammer and bleat, work, work, no day to shirk, while goblins cough and goblins laugh, round, round for underground below, my lad. It sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to the clap, snack, and the crush, smash, and the ugly laughter of their ho-ho, my lad. The general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out whips and whipped them with a smack, and sent them running as fast as they could in front of them. More than one of the dwarves were already yammering and bleating like anything, and when they stumbled into a big cavern, it was lit by a great red fire in the middle, and by torches along the walls, and it was full of goblins. They all laughed and stamped and clapped their hands when the dwarves, with poor little Bilbo at the back and nearest to the whips, came running in while the goblin drivers whooped and cracked their whips behind. The ponies were already there, huddled in the corner, and there were all the baggages and packages lying broken open and being rummaged by goblins, and smelt by goblins, and fingered by goblins, and quarreled over by goblins. I'm afraid that was the last they ever saw of those excellent little ponies, including a jolly, sturdy little white fellow that Elrond had lent to Gandalf, since his horse was not suitable for the mountain path. For goblins eat horses, and ponies, and donkeys, and other much more dreadful things. And they are always hungry. Just now, however, the prisoners were thinking only of themselves. The goblins chained their hands behind their backs and linked them all together in a line and dragged them to the far end of the cavern, with little Bilbo tugging at the end of the rope. There, in the shadow, on a large, flat stone sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing around him, carrying the axes and the bent swords that they use. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves, when they take the trouble, though they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they make very well, or get other people to make to their designs. Prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and and explosions always delighted them. And also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days, in those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them. But they had a special grudge against Thorin's people, because of the war which you have heard mentioned, but which does not come into this tale. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch, as long as it is done smart and secret, and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves. Who are all these miserable persons? Said the great goblin. Dwarves, and this, said one of the drivers, pulling at Bilbo's chain so that he fell forward onto his knees. We found him sheltering in our front porch. What do you mean by it? Said the great goblin, turning to Thorin. Up to no good, warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say? Sorin is a dwarf at your service, he replied. It was merely a polite nothing. Of the things which you suspect and imagine, we had no idea at all. We sheltered from the storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatever. That was true enough. Said the great goblin. So you say. Might I ask what you were doing up in the mountains at all? And where you were coming from? And where you were going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good. Thorin Oakenshield, I know too much about your folk already. But let's have the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you. We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, and first and second and third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers who live on the east sides of these truly hospitable mountains, said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say at all at once in a moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do it all. He's a liar! Oh, truly tremendous one, said one of the drivers. Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below. Oh, and they are dead as stones. Oh, sir, he has not explained this. He held out the sword which Thorin had worn, the sword which came from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. They had called it orcrist, goblin cleaver, but the goblins called it simply biter. They hated it and hated worse anyone that carried it. "Murderers and their friends!" the great goblin shouted. Slash them! Bite them! Beat them! Gnash them! Take them away to dark holes full of snakes, and never let them see the light again. He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorn with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went out poof, into a tower of blue glowing smoke right up to the roof that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls and curses, shrieking and shrieking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wildcats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with it. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. He fell dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me, quick," said a voice, fierce and quiet. But before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot. At the end of the line, down more dark passages, with the yells of the goblin hall growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on. "Quicker, quicker," said the voice. "The torches will soon be relit." "Oh, half a minute," said Dory, who was at the back next to Bilbo, and a decent fellow. He made the hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best as he could with his tied hands. Then off they all went at a run, with a clink, clink of change, and many stumble, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they must have been right down in the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf. But just then they were too busy to ask how he had got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam as if goblins were about. Now it was bright as blue flame, for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring, the foe hammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it beater and hated it worse than biter if possible. Orcrist too had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for friends in a tight corner. "Are we all here?" said he, handing his sword back to Thorn with a bow. "Let me see. 1, that's Thorn. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Feely and Keely? Yep, here they are. 12, 13, and here's Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, it might be worse. And then again, might be a good deal better. No ponies and no food. No knowing quite where we are. And hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go." On they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far behind in the passages they had come through. That sent them on faster than ever. This poor Bilbo could not possibly go half as fast, for dwarves can roll at a tremendous pace, I can tell you, when they have to. they took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They had made the paths themselves and were madly angry. So that do what they could, the dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could even hear the flap of the goblin feet. Many, many feet, which only seemed just around the last corner. The blink of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. Oh, why did I ever leave my hob at all? Said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Balder's back. Oh, why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on the treasure hunt? Said poor Bomber, who was fat and staggered along with the sweat dripping down his nose in his heat and terror. At this point, Gandalf fell behind, and Thorin with him. They turned a sharp corner. About turn, he shouted. Draw your sword, Thorin. There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying round the corner in full cry and found Goblin Cleaver and Foehammer shining cold and bright right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped their torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more and leaped back, knocking over those that were running after them. "A biter in Beta!" they shrieked. And soon they were all in confusion, and most of them were hustling back the way they had come. It was quite a long while before any of them dared to turn that corner. By that time, the dwarves had gone on again a long, long way into the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. When the goblins discovered that, they pulled out their torches and they slipped on soft shoes. They chose out their very quickest runners with the sharpest ears and eyes. These ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, with hardly any more noise than bats. And that is why neither Bilbo, nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf heard them coming, nor did they see them. But they were seen by the goblins that ran silently up behind. For Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly, Dory, now at the back again carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on a hard rock, and remembered nothing more.